Right, what we're going to do is just demonstrate quickly how we can protect the piece with some masking tape prior to removing it using a razor saw. So what we do is we take a small piece of masking tape, butting the long edge of it up to that angle between the FLIR pod, in this case, and the casting base. And so you can see, hopefully, that the tape completely covers the side elevation of the FLIR pod. And we simply repeat the process. In the best Blue Peter traditions, here's a piece of tape to hand. There's my razor saw ready. Quickly trim off some of the excess masking tape, makes it easier to manipulate. And here I have a little wooden block I use for supporting the workpiece. So hopefully you can now see casting base, FLIR pod, edge of the wooden block. That's the line there. That'll be cutting I make with the master craftsman's, fumbled my line there, didn't I? Make with the razor saw. As you can see, you need to keep control of the thing and stop sawing when it slips. Don't rush this. You're far better off doing it slowly and carefully. And it doesn't matter if you have a little bit of the casting base left over, because we're going to be sanding that smooth anyway. There we go. So, FLIR pod wrapped in the masking tape, and the fag end of the casting base can just go in the bin. Off with the masking tape. And there we have it. So the next step is just to sand it down smooth. The way I've cut it, there's a slight chamfer on it. But that doesn't matter because you can remove it. Just gently sanding. Again, I'm going to turn it around. I'll try and do this sideways onto camera. At this stage, I'm just going to demonstrate an alternative. Out from under the work place, a small piece of wet and dry. And just with a circular motion, progressively working it until, hopefully you can see, we have a finished piece with a flat mating surface ready to go onto the model. So that's the FLIR pod. The second part is the infrared line scan pod, which sits flush on the belly of the aircraft. Now it's cast in a similar fashion to the forward-looking infrared, with this moulding block and the part sitting up from it. Now, we have to get rid of the moulding block. What I'm going to do is to demonstrate an alternative approach, not using the razor saw. So again, taking the masking tape and pressing it in to the border, the margin between the casting block and the part itself. What we're doing is making sure that the part we're interested in this case the infrared line scan pod, is nicely protected. And the benefit of the masking tape is A, that it protects, and B, it also gives us something of a better grip on the part. Now, it's also, the infrared line scan pod is also rather shallower than the FLIR pod, and perhaps the razor saw isn't the best approach to separating it off. So what we have is a piece of fairly coarse, this is I think 150 grade abrasive paper. Taking the now wrapped in masking tape pod, use a circular motion pressing on the abrasive nice and flat, so you're taking the casting base off nice and evenly. Now this approach is controlled, you're not going to damage the pod itself, but it's also very slow. And if, like me, you're rather more impatient about these things, then there's a couple of other ways that you can go about this. Down in the garage I've got a belt sander. It's a ferocious bit of kit, but provided one is very careful, it will take that casting base off in seconds. Of course, it will also do incredible damage to the ends of your fingers if you're not very, very careful, and of course runs the risk of going too far and taking too much off the actual pod itself. But if you're careful with it and controlled, you can get to the situation where, by running it horizontally on the belt sander, you end up with a wafer thin sliver of the casting base around, which you can then separate off with a scalpel and just finish off very quickly back on the abrasive paper. Slightly less aggressive than the belt sander is of course the average domestic electric sander, or indeed one of those little detail sanders with the triangular sanding base that you can buy for about 15 quid in B&Q. But as with most things, much will depend on the approach of the domestic authorities, or the attitude of the domestic authorities, to using electric sanders inside for modelling and not for that all-important DIY job. So whichever approach you take, the abrasive flat on the modelling bench, or the high-speed aggressive electric sander approach, what you're aiming to end up with is the infrared line scan separated off a flat, smooth bottom, because ultimately it mounts flat and horizontally onto the flat belly of the aircraft. We'll come to that in a few minutes. So now, having dealt with your FLIR pod, and your infrared line scan, you have the two items from Relish Resins 01 ready to go. And what of course you don't have from Relish is the laser rangefinder marked target seeker pod, which mirrors the FLIR pod on the underside of the aircraft. And the reason we haven't done that as a separate part is because all the kit manufacturers provide it, and it seems very little point to us in making one, charging people for it, when the kit manufacturers generally do a perfectly adequate job with the kit part. What I'm now going to deal with is fixing on the Relish Resins 01 FLIR pod and the infrared line scan pod. Now, very much like Blue Peter, I've started the model well in advance of getting to this stage of the video instructions. I have to say this is the IRLS 48 scale Tornado. Something with curate's egg. It's strictly speaking not a GR4 because the navigators and pilots' main instrument panels are incorrectly laid out for the current fit of the GR4, but that's something we'll perhaps address in the not too distant future. So the model's basically assembled, filled and sanded down and primed on the underside. And what I've done is already installed the kit supplied laser rangefinder marked target seeker pod. Now, as the aircraft flies, and you have to be careful of this when you're working upside down, as the aircraft flies, the laser rangefinder marked target seeker pod is on the right hand side. So if you've got the model upside down, it will be on your left. So it's worth thinking the thing through and being very, very careful when you come to applying the pods, because what you don't want is to end up with them juxtaposed onto the wrong sides. Now, just for clarity, what I've done is with the FLIR pod, I hope you can see the tiny black square, is I've just blacked in the aperture on the front of the FLIR pod. Just for demonstration purposes, that's about how it sits on the aircraft. You really need to check your references here. It's not easy. There's not a lot of width there between the nose wheel belly and the curve, and it is a curve, not a right angle, around to the side of the fuselage. So FLIR pod on the right when you've got the model upside down, on the left as the aircraft flies, and the infrared line scan sits centrally and slightly further back. And again, I've just highlighted, and I hope you can see this, onto the infrared line scan there's a little blip. I just highlighted that because that goes to the back of this chamfered fairing. Now the fairing in real life, I would imagine, I don't know, protects the optics or the sensor window, whatever it is, for the infrared line scan. So ultimately on the GR4 you will end up with laser rangefinder marked target seeker, FLIR pod, and on a 4A you'll have the addition of the infrared line scan. But read the Relish Resins 01 instruction sheet, because we've done a little table which sets out what aircraft or what mark of aircraft carries what.